I was reading an interesting little article by a woman. Her name's Becky. And she was talking about, she was on the road driving to a doctor's appointment. And she was on the phone talking. Now, I'm sure she had it as a hands-free kind of thing. But she was talking, and I understand this because when I'm sometimes driving, even if I'm not on the phone, but just talking out loud, I get like this too. But she got to talking on the phone and missed a turn to the doctor's office, or missed the turn to the doctor's office. Well, she keeps going and talking and going and talking, and until she realizes, wow, she is way down the road. So she stops and tries to backtrack. And so she finally gets back to the doctor's. She goes in, and she is told she's too late. She's missed the appointment, and so that's it. Well, because of the times that we're living in, of course, this was a difficult appointment to get because of the virus. And so there she is in tears in front of this receptionist who is, has a little concern for her. But here she is making a wrong turn. How many of us make wrong turns as Christians? We all do. We make wrong turns every day. And yet, oftentimes we find ourselves down the road and we try to backtrack and get back on track. Fortunately, God is not as as rigid as that receptionist was to Becky. Instead, our God is kind and gracious and so forth. But we all as Christians make wrong turns every day, whether it's in attitudes, whether it's in our speech, whether it's in our behavior, whether it's in the relationships we make. We make all kinds of wrong turns. And I want to kind of remind you that the Bible shows us God uses imperfect people. And the reason for that is because who else is God going to use? And the one perfect individual that God did use, we crucified. But let me remind you of some of the more famous names of the Bible. Noah, Noah built the ark after having found favor with God. But then once the flood was over and he got back to, doing his usual routine, he created, planted a vineyard, got drunk. Now, I'm not going to suggest that, we toss Noah aside, and you wouldn't either, but he did. He got drunk. And then there's Abraham. Abraham's called by God. He's out in the Ur of Chaldees, and he comes to Haran. His father dies, and then God says, you need to complete the journey. And so he comes down to the land of Canaan, and, God says, I'm going to give this land to your descendants. You're going to sojourn in it, but I'll give it to them. And what's interesting too is that Abraham in Romans chapter 4 is called the father of the faithful. He just is. If we are sons of Abraham, we are sons of Abraham if we have faith. And so Abraham is kind of at the top of our list of our heroes, and yet he lied twice to save his own skin. He put Sarah at risk for being taken by another man. Now, and in both cases, she was taken by Pharaoh and then by Abimelech, but God, of course, stepped in before anything happened and got her out of there. And I don't know what to make of this, but the first time anyway, Abraham walked away a rather rich man, or richer, because of it. But still, Abraham lied twice. And then there's David. David, he's a man after God's own heart, demonstrated his faith in God when Saul had no faith in God. David persevered while Saul persecuted him. And then finally David, I mean, David wouldn't even kill Saul because he was God's anointed. And finally, David gets into power, and he, is a great leader. And then one day, when he should have been out on the battlefield, he's walking around, sees a beautiful woman, takes her. And I think that there's I think that even though the Bible doesn't perhaps specifically lay this out, I think that there's evidence that David kind of forced himself on her. He sent guards to get her and bring her up, and I don't think that Bathsheba necessarily went willingly. I know that there are some who try to say that's why she was out bathing, but I don't think that that's it. But anyway, so David commits sexual sin with Bathsheba, and then he murders her husband to cover up the pregnancy that results from what he did. And of course, because of this, David had to deal with consequences, even though God forgave him all down the line. And then as if David didn't learn enough from that, towards the end of his life, he decided he wanted to know how big his army was. And so he sent Joab out to count them. And Joab's got blood on his hands from the very beginning. And even Joab knows that this isn't a good idea, but yet he goes and counts. And David is punished by God for it. Solomon, what's interesting, Solomon in Chronicles is not, his sin of idolatry isn't mentioned. He just builds the temple, and in fact, to some degree, he's kind of used as a model for the other kings, as kind of part of the model, not as much as David. But, Solomon, gets this grand heritage from his father. You are the fulfillment of this promise that God made to me, that he's going to build me a house. And here you are, I've made all the arrangements to build the temple, for you to build the temple and so forth. And so Solomon builds the temple, and he's been, God says, you can have anything you want. And Solomon asks for wisdom. If God asked me for anything I want, I'm not sure wisdom would be high on my list. But, so Solomon gets wisdom plus riches and honor. And then he goes and takes 700 wives and 300 concubines. And later in his life, his wives, who are foreign women. And, this is why God said don't marry outsiders, not because of a racial thing, but because of a religious thing. They turned Solomon's heart against God, and he began to worship these other gods. What a tragedy that is. And then there's going back before Solomon, there's Jephthah, who is one of the judges. And one of the interesting things to me about the book of Judges is that the book of Judges actually, I think from beginning to end, demonstrates what I'm talking about, that God uses imperfect people, really imperfect people, in order to accomplish his will. But Jephthah, he promises God, if you'll give me victory, whatever comes out to meet me, I'll sacrifice as a burnt offering. And when he gets back, it's his daughter. And, I know that there are a lot who try to say, that we don't really understand what was going on there. But it sure seems to me that's what was happening. And yet Jephthah is listed in Hebrews chapter 11 as part of the faithful. And yet he sacrificed his own human sacrifice. And God said specifically in the law, don't do that. But he did it. He really misunderstood God on a number of things. And then, of course, as another judge, there's Samson. I used to call Samson a womanizer. I don't think he is. I think instead he's weak around women. He sees a woman, got to have her. He sees the prostitute, got to have her. Sees Delilah, got to have her. And he's willing to do anything in order to have them, in order to be them. And he is just weak at the knees when it comes to women. And yet God uses him, gives him this great strength, and Samson leads, all these victories. And then, of course, at the end, he gives one last great victory. There's Samuel. Samuel, has this a great upbringing with his mom Hannah, and I'm sure she taught him about what a great thing God did for her by even though she was barren all those years, and here he was, and of course she had more sons and daughters afterwards. But Samuel gets this, he gets in as a young boy, he gets this revelation from God about Eli, and he's so loyal to Eli, he doesn't want to tell him at first, but he does, and Samuel becomes this great priest and prophet, and yet we look at his two sons. They're as bad as Eli's sons, poor. So there's one thing, well, maybe he did learn this from Eli, poor parenting. He's a man of God. He's rich in faith, and yet what happened to his two sons? Going back into the Kings, Jehoshaphat, to me, is an interesting fellow. And the reason why I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Jehoshaphat is because in teaching through Chronicles 1 year, it takes about a year to do that. I noticed a pattern in the Kings that when they were good kings, they were faithful kings, but then there were the really faithful kings, and they were likened to David. And Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah are the only ones who are likened to David. So Jehoshaphat really stands out, and in the book of Chronicles, he really does. He doesn't get quite as much attention in Kings. But what's interesting to me is that Jehoshaphat is this great king, and he makes an alliance with Ahab. Now we know he's not compromising his own personal faith, because when he makes this alliance with Ahab, and Ahab has all these prophets, he says, well, hey, wait a second, isn't there a prophet of Yahweh? And so he does listen to one. But what's interesting, and most don't probably miss this, 2 Kings chapter 9 and verse 18, we find out that Jehoshaphat's son married the daughter of Ahab, and thus the daughter of Jezebel. And she's going to cause some problems in the Davidic dynasty down here in just a little bit. Then there's Hezekiah. Hezekiah is this great king. In fact, in Chronicles and in Kings, he gets this long section in which God details through this inspired prophet what's going on in the life of Hezekiah and what all the reforms that he makes. But once he gets that all done, these envoys from Babylon show up, and then Hezekiah takes them out and shows them all of Jerusalem and all of the treasures and all of the stuff in the temple. And of course Isaiah says, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm just showing them around. And so that's when it's revealed that Babylon's going to be the nation to destroy them, just not in Hezekiah's lifetime. But I think it kind of shows a little bit lack on Hezekiah's part. Now, such, we find in the New Testament as well. James and John, we find out that they're called sons of thunder. And the reason for that is because when this Samaritan village snubbed Jesus, they said, hey, we got to do something about this. Let's call down fire from heaven. And no wonder Jesus called them that. But man, and then of course later on they said, hey, we want a favor from you. We want to sit on your right and left hand. Now, I don't know who gets the right and who gets the left between them. I don't know if they'd work that out between them. And we also find out that they'd gotten their mom to go and ask about this. So here's James and John. And then there's Peter. Now, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And I don't think he does that out of fear. I think he is so despondent over what's happened that he just does it. But he denies Jesus 3 times. This Peter, who, when the crowd came to arrest Jesus, he pulls out a sword and cuts off somebody's ear. And of course, even though I haven't, and then there's, I'll get to him in just a second. Hopping back into the Old Testament, my notes are a little bit sketchy right now. The 10 sons of Jacob, they sell Joseph into slavery. And God's using them to do that. And of course, fortunately, I think most of them learned better as time went on. And then, of course, there's Saul of Tarsus, who is persecuting the church big time. But we know that somebody, even like Saul, can be reformed and transformed. But you see, when we look at this, guess what? God uses him because that's all he's got to work with. That's all that are there. Now, I have to admit, I'm trying to give Esther and Mordecai sort of a fair hearing, and give them the benefit of the doubt sometimes. But there are those who say that there are hints that Esther and Mordecai are kind of nominal in their faith. And of course, when you compare them to Daniel and his three friends, that may not be all that far off. But in Esther chapter 2, verse 10, it says that Mordecai told Esther not to reveal her heritage. Why? Daniel, he was very upfront with his heritage. Hey, not only his heritage, but his faith. My faith will not allow me to eat this stuff. I don't want to do it. And he was very successful in asking for a continuance. Some have suggested, well, we only know Mordecai by his sort of Persian/Babylonian name, that his name is associated with a Babylonian god. And it's possible that we find out that he kind of lives in Susa and works there. And maybe he's taken on that name in order to keep a low profile. Although, you do have to give him kind of credit, because later on when Haman becomes second in command and wants everybody to bow down to him, Mordecai refuses to do it. So, but some say, that, is there a hint there that Mordecai's kind of nominal as well in his faith? And, I brought this up, you have to remember that when these events with Esther and Mordecai occur, this is about 115 to 120 years after the exile started. And so Mordecai and Esther were both born in exile. They weren't brought over like Daniel and his three friends. And so who knows what their parents might have taught them early on, and what and why they were doing this. And it's possible that this was the way that they felt that they had to, and that they had to survive. And so Mordecai's name may suggest that he was kind of keeping his faith hidden. And of course, Esther listens to Mordecai. He says, don't reveal, and she didn't. But then when Esther is, of course, taken into the harem and is being prepared, it says in chapter 2, verse 9, that the young lady pleased him and found favor, so he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, and gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. So now she's not getting that because she's living her faith. She's getting that just because she's a very pleasant young woman. At least that's what it appears. Okay, so but again, contrast this with Daniel, who said, I'm not going to eat the king's unclean food. Give us vegetables only. Esther doesn't do that. And then she becomes sort of part of this pagan king. She marries a pagan king. And again, to some degree, this is kind of what Solomon did that led to his downfall. He married pagan women, and it did. So there's hints that Mordecai and Esther are imperfect people. But again, that's all God has to work with. That's all we are. Are we up to the standard of Daniel and his 3 friends? Are we up to the standard of Abraham? maybe not, but nonetheless, God uses imperfect people. And so as we read through Esther, I think that it's possible. I've pointed out that in the arrangement of the Old Testament in Jesus' day, that it's possible that Esther and Daniel are together, and that there's a little bit of contrast going on here between them. Or maybe this is two different views of how one lives in exile. That there are those who right up front are faithful and they are blessed, but there are those who take a little bit longer to get to that faithful spot. But how often, though, do we not use somebody because, we don't think they're quite, up to our standards? But hey, none of us are up to God's standards, and yet he uses us. And perhaps maybe we should rethink through how we can use people. But I think we should see the church in exile. And God's going to use whoever he wants and whoever is available. He's going to put people in various spots and give them opportunities. It might be pretty big. It might be pretty small. He might give us an opportunity to save, a town, a village, or you might, a family, or it might be one individual. We don't know what God might use us. And God will use unbelievers to assist us. Sometimes there was a young man. He showed up. We didn't really know what his intentions were at the time, but he showed up to church, and somebody announced, one of the elders announced that we needed men to sign up to mow the church lawn, and he did. And one of the elders told him, they kind of tried talking him out of that, but anyway, fortunately, we baptized him a little bit later on, and he mowed the church lawn. But I think that there's something that the church can do in order to help with this. Even though Esther and Mordecai seem kind of disconnected from the community of faith, or at least, and that's another thing that appears to make them nominal, is that they don't have the connection that perhaps Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Daniel and his three friends had. But I think that the church needs to, while we're in exile, we need to keep that close connection. And first of all, I think we need to encourage everybody to live up to what we've obtained. Paul, as he wrote to the Philippians in chapter 3, in verse 16, I'll get there. Said, however, let us keep living by that same standard to which we have attained. I think Paul is suggesting, okay, wherever you are, live by that, and then when you get up further, then continue to live by that. So we need to encourage everybody to live up to what they've obtained. We also need to encourage everybody to grow even more. Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, in verse 1 says, finally, brethren, we request and exhort you in the Lord Jesus that as you received from us instruction as to how you ought to walk and please God, just as you actually do walk, that you excel still more. Now, Paul's got something specific in mind, but I think that here we get the idea that God wants us to grow. So you've hit this standard. Don't stop there. I mentioned that we used to do 3 unusual days up in Randolph, New Jersey when I was there. Actually, we probably had 4 different guys come up and do, 3 different guys, 4 different times. 2 of them was by Jack Exum. And I thought Jack Exum was one of the most gentle, loving Christian men I've ever met in my life. And when he got up and talked about giving on Sunday morning, that was kind of the purpose of the 3 unusual days. He said, okay, so you think maybe we ought to give 10%. Don't stop there. Grow. Okay, suppose, you don't believe in the 10%. Suppose, you give 2%. Okay, give that, but grow. So he encouraged us to never be satisfied with where we are, but to grow. And we also need to make sure that our standard is the Father's standard. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 48, Jesus says, just as the Heavenly Father is perfect, so you too be perfect. Now there, the word perfect doesn't mean 100%. There it's used as, the idea of maturity. And, the maturity that Jesus was talking about was, God, causing the rain on the good and the not so good and so forth. So, God blesses both good and bad, at least from our perspective. And so we need to have our standard as the Heavenly Father's. And sometimes, we can still encourage the less than perfect. Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 through 17, Paul said, some to be sure are preaching Christ even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, rather than from pure motives, thinking they might cause me my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. I think we should sometimes not worry about people whose motives aren't exactly what we want them to be. And so we need to sometimes, as the church, realize that we are called to give people to work. And even though they might not be, the best at something, or they might, or even though they might be, not quite up in their, in their Christian life the way we want them to, that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't use them. We should be a little bit like God. God uses imperfect people. And sometimes when God uses those imperfect people, they grow tremendously. That's what happened with Mordecai and Esther. When the threat came up, and Esther realized what she had to do, she said, if I perish, I perish. And so because of that, she gets her own book in God's scripture. So we need to encourage folks to serve, even if they're less than what we want them to serve. And how often over the years I've discovered that sometimes just by giving people a job, that's the way to make them grow. There was a brother up in New Jersey that was working on a doctor of ministry degree. And he did a little study of 5 churches in New Jersey, 5 churches in New York State, and 5 in Pennsylvania, and asked them, okay, over the last 10 years, look at all of your baptisms, who's faithful, who's not, and tell me what was done on those that were faithful. And of course, he, came up with, they got teaching, and number 2, they had friends in the congregation. But number 3, they got a job to do. Here were Esther and Mordecai, and God said, I've got a job for you. And they did it rather well. Well, they did. And we in the church need to do the same thing as well. We need to give people work to do. And so find some work and find people to do it. And even if they're not quite, who cares whether they're nominal or whether they're faithful, whether they're nominal or whether they're, whatever. Give them work to do. So you see, Esther shows us that God uses people that aren't necessarily the kind of heroes that we look up to. He uses people that kind of keeping their heads down, but when they're needed, they rise to the top and become what God needs them to be. And so that's what needs to happen with all of us. We need to give God our best, but who knows when God may call us. You are an imperfect person. Let God use you each and every day. God bless.